everyone. Welcome. I hope everyone is feeling as passionate as I am, especially after watching that powerful documentary. We're extremely excited to be here. I'm extremely excited to be joined here today with James Rutenbeck and Kafi Dixon, the two producers of the film. And I'm really, again, looking forward to leading such a dynamic conversation with you all about some of the major themes that emerged from the film. It was my second time watching it, and I felt as if I was able to take away so much more than from even my very first time watching it. So, and I think as well for me, a lot of the themes in the film ring especially true, as a native Bostonian, born and raised in Boston, as a first generation Cape Verdean American, and seeing a lot of those realities captured so well in the film. And so, there are so many things that I want to try to discuss today, and I hope our time will allow for us to cover the majority of it. But there's so many themes and key topics that you two touched on in the film, from Boston's complex racial legacy to thinking through economic mobility and the lack of access to opportunities for many, and kind of going back to this larger theme of who is Boston designed for, which I think, really correlates to a lot of the work that we do at ICIC to think about the key issues facing under-resourced communities and working to find solutions to target those and help drive inclusive economic prosperity. And so, I think as well, the timing of this documentary is key as we, as many of you may know, yesterday actually marks the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, and thinking through the work that a lot of us have done this past year as we come to a racial awakening, and how so many of the themes here, despite it being filmed a couple of years ago, are still so relevant as we think through that. So with that, I'll kind of kick it off. And again, I'm hoping that this can be more of just a dialogue, of a conversation, as we just start to unpack so many of these themes. So I actually wanted to kind of start with you, James. And you kind of touched on this a bit in the film, but I think it sounds as though, when you first started on this documentary project, it didn't seem as if you really could foresee the direction this project would take and the impact it would have. And I think about how powerful it is that you, Kafi, and Carl are producers of this film, and that you all have the agency to really drive the narrative around your stories, and really, taking that ownership, which again is another major theme that we see in the film. And so, James, I'd love to just hear a little bit about kind of how your own reckoning came about, and how you kind of saw yourself shifting from just a director to an actual part of this larger conversation.
I'm sure. Marynee, thank you so much for moderating today, and thank you ICIC for hosting this event. It's really an honor to be here. When I started in 2014, I had this idea. I had heard a graduate of the Clemente course talk about her experience as a year-long student in this rigorous night course and how it transformed her life. And I think for any of us who have had the opportunity to go to college and have experienced higher education, we know that engagement with art, philosophy, history, and literature can really change not only how we think, but how we see ourselves and our place in the world. And the intention of the Clemente course is to allow students who haven't had that experience to be able to have it and to become freer, as I say in the film, fuller and freer citizens. And I think you definitely see that in Kafi's story, like her, when she first meets with basically her trajectory as a civically engaged person. You can see in the film how that develops, and that's a powerful idea. But what happened was, I wanted to make this sort of, small film about people engaging with art and philosophy and literature, and sort of witnessing their experience of it. But I always knew I wanted a little bit of the context of their daily lives, and their lived experience, which they bring into the course, but I also thought, that would be a piece of this film. And I thought I'd be able to do it over the course of a year, at most 2 years. But then what happened was, I started spending more time with Kafi and Carl, and a little bit with Tolga as well. And, Kafi very kindly sort of ushered me in a little bit and guided me into her experience of the city. I started spending more time and seeing, Kafi took me to housing court. She took me to the welfare office, into the housing agency. And I began to see things that had really been hidden from me as a white man living in Newton, who in some ways now I see myself as someone who is in some ways protected in a way, and privileged. And that was a bit of a wake-up call for me, I guess, because I realized I was in over my head at a certain point, and that I was not really equipped to mediate these stories alone. And so we had been spending so much time together talking about the film and about Kafi and Carl's lives and their life experience, that I recognized that they needed a formal acknowledgement of that. So I brought them in as producers to work with me on the film. And then, over time, we had screenings mostly with white audiences, which in retrospect was a mistake, and it was something Kafi warned me against. But it just happens that a lot of the documentary community is white. It's a very white world, especially in Boston. And if you go to a film festival almost anywhere, my experience is that you're mostly around white people. And so the film wasn't really coming together. There were audiences that were confused by it. And Kafi and Carl and I went up to Maine, and we met with an executive from ITVS, Nolan Walker, who's a Black vice president of content at ITVS, which is a big funder of independent documentaries. And Nolan said to me, James, unless you bring yourself into this film and be as vulnerable as Kafi and Carl have been for you, this film will just be like every other film of its kind. And then on the drive home, Kafi said, well, James, are you feeling afraid to do that? Like, is that, and I recognized that I was fearful of that. And I recognized that being a witness and just filming and being behind a camera was a way of protecting myself and shielding myself and not being vulnerable in the way that I was asking these other people to be vulnerable. And so that was sort of the next deeper entry into these waters of making this film for me, was to find a way to bring my voice into it. And so, I don't want to go on and on about this, but Kafi and Carl and some other people that worked with us, all people of color, met fairly regularly to work on the film and talk about my voice. My deepest fear was that I would become too much of a presence in the film, and I didn't want that. I think in the end, our goal was to allow my voice to bring sharper relief to Kafi and Carl's stories, and not so much to develop myself as a character. And so we did it together. And I think that there's no way I could have done it alone. It would not have been the authentic film that it is. And I think we're all, I think the film is resonating for audiences because of that.
I think no one can really negate how powerful the stories of Kafi and Carl were. And I think, James, one of the things that I noticed that you did was you really did bring this new dynamic of really showcasing this other side of Boston, which I think was a really central theme of the film. You often see Boston being presented as such a progressive, liberal city, this resource-rich city that is filled with opportunities, yet you cross Mass Ave and it's a completely different story. It's a completely different reality for so many people in the city, especially brown and Black folks that we live here. And so, Kafi, I know you've obviously have been on the front lines of a lot of these conversations, and as it relates to your co-op, but also in terms of really helping us come to terms with this reality.
Yeah.
I know you all kind of worked on this film since started working on it in 2014, 2015. But I guess I'm curious to see how you've seen some of these conversations shift since the time of the filming of the film, and also how you've seen others, particularly maybe in your community or others that you've been in conversations that have their own reckoning with the other side, this other side of Boston that this film exposed.
I hate to burst your bubble, but we haven't had those conversations. It's still, oddly enough, I understand that there are some people who will personally, within their own consciousness, push back on the idea that Boston is not an all-embracing liberal startup, you know, we can all do what we want to do type place. And this a similar fear, although, you know, James's fear, I understood James's fear. I understood James's fear with one, taking over the story, right? Another, how do you tell the story of these communities without, again, making the story about you? But there's another side to that fear from the perspective of white-facing communities. And James, you were not guilty of this, but I understand these stories create fear. These experiences create fear, and that fear can be paralyzing. And we all experience how fear is paralyzing in the city. Racism itself is based on fear, right? The fear that that person next to you is equally as competent, intelligent, capacity driven as you are. And so what does that mean for, you know, the pedestals that we put ourselves on, that American society puts itself on, and even in Massachusetts and in liberal communities in Boston, when you are no longer the hero, it might actually be the oppressor. And so how do you have those conversations with yourself and the work that you've done? Have you taken someone's voice? Have you stunted someone's growth of capacity? Have you held the gates, and have you upheld white supremacy? So we have not had those conversations yet, and I'm actually thankful for them. I'm thankful that people are thinking about this story and being thoughtful about it, and my hope is that they'll come to a proper understanding of exactly what James was able to film and the stories that Carl and I were able to guide. So no, we haven't had those conversations yet, which is why it's so powerful that we're coming to ICIC, as I realize that ICIC is getting in front of what a competitive city looks like, and how are we diverse in that intention.
Definitely. And I think to your point too, before you can have any type of reckoning, you have to have those internal conversations to really think through that deeper, to say, how have I potentially been complicit in these systems, and how are you able to work back from that? And I know, again, that's something that we've seen a lot of people and a lot of organizations attempt to do in this past year, in light of a lot of the civil unrest. And I know Boston as well has struggled with that as we've kind of grappled.
It's been completely bonkers to me to watch the still people not getting it right. Some organizations and institutions were doing it right, and it was heartfelt to see. But I remember we were talking to one organization who was an all-white organization who was creating the Black Commons with all white organizations and making a request for land for Black farmers, when I had to ask them, if you know of any other maternal, paternal Black farmers or African diaspora farmers in Massachusetts, connect me with them because I want to know them. But if you don't, who are you collecting land for?
Mm-hmm.
And that was part of Black Lives. Well, I shouldn't say. I don't want to disparage it. You know, the institution of Black Lives Matters and the concept of Black Lives Matters.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, those were some of the type of things, you know, to think about the Black Commons and think about what economic development means. And to have very few Black facing organizations or organizations founded by people of color who are reflective of that class, socioeconomic class and experience that could speak to the idea of what the commons were for Black people. So, I mean, yes, I've been watching people try to do this work, and that is my witnessing, as James would say.
Yeah. And I think that kind of leads to another kind of major conversation. And I think something else that emerged, and I think it was a quote that came out that I saw that stuck with me. It's like the community taking back the city for itself. And I think that's something that you, in a way, Kafi, with your cooperative, have really been able to do, and really providing a space for ownership and a space for these women to really come together and find opportunity in a city where they've really been marginalized, and to find those opportunities when they've been marginalized for so long. And I think being able to be at the front of those movements and really, you know, I think back to those really frustrating scenes with the DND and with the BPDA, as you're actively, as you're trying to advocate for yourself, as you're trying to create those spaces. And I think back to how we know so many BIPOC-owned business owners go into entrepreneurship because that's one of the only viable opportunities for economic mobility that they can find. They either they maybe are a returning citizen, or they have something in their past that's preventing employers from hiring them, and they have to go into entrepreneurship as the only means for supporting themselves. And I think what you've been able to do with the cooperative is so powerful and speaks to that collective power of bringing our community together, taking these vacant lots and really repurposing it for themselves too.
A lot of what I beg the business industry to understand, because the issues are complex, and this documentary, you couldn't make any of this up. I mean, even sometimes I sat with James at Flat Black in meetings, like literally staring at him, with him staring at me, just like, you know, having to be gentle with each other, that we had just witnessed something so incredible. We didn't even really know how to talk about it ourselves, as friends, as cohorts, as coworkers. And that was something. But the thing about the business community, I had to, in order for people to fully understand about the importance of economic development, and as it being the great equalizer, right? Based on race, culture, and class. And I'm not talking about the detrimental capitalistic, you know, everybody's out for themselves. But if we look at it through different models, cooperative models, I mean, there are many different models to look at how economic development stabilizes rather than destables. And it is the small business owner or the mid-sized business owner. It is the business owner of color. The reason that Boston has, unfortunately, so if you go to the website, Common Good Cooperatives, I've constantly been changing around that website, because I know that people are going to question or to invalidate my experiences by saying, well, is she a farmer? And what does she know about urban farming? What does she know about rural farming? What does she know about business development? What does she know about cooperative models, right? How long has she been doing this? Because it's easier to invalidate those experiences and to marginalize them than to say that she came here with the competence and capacity, like many possible business owners, BIPOC businesses of owner, and the system failed. So I've had to put up on my on the website the picture of me when I first came back from Connecticut, opening up a produce market in Ashmont Station, Milk and Honey Produce Market, and how Ashmont Main Streets and D&D failed me then by convincing me to close down my store, and the story behind that. And you know, then the announcement of the co-op and how we were in the you know, this large funding institution, and how did they fund the co-op model or attend to the voices or be responsive to the voices of the women of color who were standing there calling out my name and calling out the co-op's name, because it was a way for them to engage in business development in a safe way, in a supported way. It was to me, if there wasn't the determination and the support, and James, Carl, and I walking through this, if I was just, you know, a Kafi Dixon with Milk and Honey Produce Market, I might have given up. I might have, unfortunately, what happens in the system is that rather than, on our side of BIPOC, rather than be, as Howard Zinn would say, rather than be the blade of grass afraid to stick out about amongst the rest and to be cut down first. You know, I think a lot of Black business owners, when their businesses fail, they internalize it rather than turn to the system and say, how is the system not there to support me as an entrepreneur or as a startup, as an African-American business, as someone who's transferred into a new business, you know, as you know, the many different aspects of diversity that come with business development. You know, we are sooner to, a lot of us, unfortunately, are sooner to internalize it rather than to turn around and question the system. I decided to turn around and question the system.
Definitely. And it reminds me of another quote that you mentioned where, you know, I think it was about, as you were going through the process with the D&D, feeling as if the city was purposely providing opportunities to others over, you know, over others as well. And I think it speaks to a lot of, you know, when you see the new development in Boston, when you see a lot of the new things, who is it really being designed for? And who is the city really, and it goes back to these themes of displacement and, you know, that economic stability. Who are these new initiatives and these new projects and these new development being aimed for, and how is it putting other business owners, other residents at a disadvantage as well?
There, you know, the thing about Boston, which is interesting, there are thought leaders in organizations and institutions that set policy aside that is equitable, that it does create equality and equity, but then the implement is like rain in the desert. It doesn't make it to the ground because the policy isn't implemented. And, you know, we as business people in the business sector, you'd have to hire an attorney or have a weird problematic relationship with politicians to make sure you understand how that policy is written and to be interpreted. It's all an in. So you saw me effectively or essentially in the documentary, again, it was wild because I wasn't doing the work for me. I came back from Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut. I had 3 businesses in Hartford, Connecticut. As a woman with that I started, to go back to your point and to come forward, I started my businesses because I didn't have a high school diploma and I had 3 children and I needed to make my own hours and I needed to bring in an income because of Clinton's welfare to work program, where, you know, essentially he told all the mothers that were on welfare, you know, 2 years, you're off. So I was up in Hartford, Connecticut. And because Hartford, Connecticut doesn't have that facade of liberal integration, you know, you're out for yourself, you were allowed to design your own space. So I had a furniture store. I had Good Night's Mattress Shop, a 600 square foot a bunk bed and bedding shop by Therapeutic Mattress and Bunky Beds or something like that that's located in Hartford. I had a produce market. I had a farm stand. And I came back to Boston and found the most challenges. And so when I looked around and realized after being gone from Boston for how many years, 10 plus years, that there were even less businesses of color. And then to be victimized and be one of those businesses of color that suffered or fell through the cracks, I said, oh my gosh, you saw me demand for transparency.
Exactly.
I didn't want a backroom deal. I did not want how most people get done what they get done in Boston is to know somebody. You know, I didn't want a backroom deal. So me throwing these epic tantrums and frustration and trying to just get this business up and running, not for myself, but for the women, I was demanding transparency, realizing that witnessing the structural violence around economic development and business development for people of color and for Native Bostonians.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, the fact that you essentially had to block out a portion of the film of that conversation to figure out the real way in order to get access to those opportunities, I think is so telling. It speaks so much louder to that message about how the inequity in accessing those opportunities, that liberal facade that you mentioned. And again, us, viewing Boston as this resource-rich city, but for only for people who want to come in, but for people here, we have the most universities and colleges here, yet it's so difficult for, I think about the one of the professors who asked the question, how many people do you know who went to college? And they can only reference a handful of people so far removed from them. So there's this massive disconnect that you're seeing between all of these resources that are here and that are perceived to be available versus people who can't actually get them.
Yep.
And that's exactly it. I mean, it's not hard to figure out. It was annoying to me that James and I were having to demand, that James in his whiteness was having to advocate in just solely his presence for the transparency, because where they would have been willing to lie to me and other people of color, other Black women standing next to me. And if you notice in those scenes, I'm not walking in there. Some coaching had to be done of the woman about what to, how to present, and not because they presented badly, but I refuse to give anybody an excuse to size us up visually. So you would have not known that Toga, where Toga's income or where Shara's income came from. You could have looked at all of us sitting in there in our business wear and said, all right, these are entrepreneurs. But to get in there and still to have to get to the point of being bristly and then to have the camera shut off. If with a camera we can't hope for transparency and the guidance of the steps to, again, participate as business people in the opportunities of the city, then who does get those opportunities? And there are a lot. I want to be honest, I don't think the city and state understands that I'm part of combis. I'm part of the city's procurement processes. I'm part of federal procurement processes.
It goes back to, again, this larger theme about, again, who has access to upward mobility, who has access to economic mobility. And I think, one of the other dynamics that, is kind of touched on as well, and I think is so prevalent in the city of Boston, as well as the role of classism and that intersection of racism and classism, and how it's able to really dictate who's allowed to be in certain rooms. And, again, just all the different dynamics coming in. And I think, in those experiences that both you and Carl shared, we're able to kind of see those all come into play with each other. I know one of the other kind of themes that kind of came up to me and really stuck with me was this idea around economic sustainability. and kind of the difficulty and for so many residents in Boston. And, you know, we saw this firsthand in your story, Kafi, about the challenges in achieving that when you are essentially at the whim of a landlord. You're constantly being displaced, job insecurity, thinking, and that feeling of not having any ownership over anything in your life. And, you know, thinking through how that's, thinking through those ripple effects and how it continues to prevent us from creating generational wealth. It prevents us from really being able to continue to go into those spaces. You know, if you, and so I guess I want to hear a little bit more, both from both of you, about that theme of economic sustainability and kind of some of those factors that you see really affecting the ability for so many Bostonians to really achieve that.
Just in touching base on that really quickly and then handing it over to James. What people have a hard time understanding is the intentionality behind the lack of economic development. If you take someone's ability to develop capacity economically, whether it's through a regular 9-to-5 job as an employee or as a contractor and consultant, you take away their ability to participate in their community. So when you decrease small business or mid-sized business ownership, so you look at Boston and you look at North Carolina, or you look at Boston and you look at certain communities that are strongholds for economic development and sustainability in community, there are more African-American vegan restaurants in DC than people would like to admit. There are more cafes, there are more businesses, there are more consultants. And what I ask is that when you come back into Boston, again, such a heavily resourced city, to ask ourselves, why is it so intentional? Why are we so intentionally denied participation? Because to be denied in participation in economic development through entrepreneurialism is to be denied the equity and equality in the city that not only stabilizes ourselves, but stabilizes our communities as a whole. Boston, we were on with a board member of BPDA, and that was fascinating. That could have been a case study within itself on the responses. No shade to him, but I mean, there was definitely some moments where I was just like, wow, you know, even as people of color, we're disconnected in class from that pull yourself up by your bootstraps is bullshit, because no startup pulls themselves up by their bootstraps. Right. And you're saying that to see me out there toiling in the sun, I didn't have on my 9 West heels, I didn't have on my Talbot's dress or shirt, right, or skirt. I was out there shoveling. So that was bootstrapped. So where are the failures in the system? So really quickly, back to economic development, one of the things that new Bostonians don't miss is that there is an entire culture being lost here in Boston of African-American or or new African-American or African diaspora restaurants, barbershops. I'd like to encourage ICIC to understand that here in Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan, the few social gathering places that we had for West Indian, Caribbean, African American are gone. I think we're down to 1 or 2. You know, one of the things we one of the statistics I quoted is that there are 60,000 minority women in Dorchester and Dorchester alone. And that doesn't even get into, you know, men, right? There's one gathering space. You have these social gathering spaces that are operating as private spaces just to hold on to their license. The city of Boston came through. The policymakers in the city of Boston allowed, without providing support to these spaces, for all of our cultural gathering spaces to be dismantled, to be gone, to be closed down. And in thinking about, and what I ask, when we say that the lost African-American community, according to the census and visually on the ground, is that we shouldn't herald that, you know, well, there might not be any more African-American businesses, but there are Cape Verdean businesses, but also that's being lost. Well, there may not be any more African-American businesses or Cape Verdean businesses, but we have Dominican businesses, right? We have, you know, New American businesses, we have Vietnamese. Once those communities are vulnerable for whatever reason, based on policy or lack of support in their businesses, again, they become vulnerable the same way African-American communities were vulnerable, and those cities can essentially be lost to other communities and cultures.
No, definitely, totally agree. James, love to hear your perspective on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, in retrospect, like thinking back on the making of the film and my original intentions, which were just to make this film about this night course, and recognizing that it's sort of surprising to me, really, that like what I was doing was just quietly, you know, filming Kafi's story, Carl's story, Tolga's story, and how that turned into something like a film that's being called incendiary. And you know, and so I had no incendiary intentions when I started this film, and I didn't even expect the film to be that. But because, you know, the disparity is so stark in this city that when people like Kafi and Carl are given a voice and are raised up and visible, it's really threatening to the city. The city cut off our access to public meetings. Yeah. There was a point where, you know, they, you know, how does the city tell any journalist that they can't film a public or be at a public meeting? I mean, in retrospect, you know, I just see that they didn't want this. There are people who just don't want these stories told because they're so shocking in a way. And so I ended up becoming, in a way, this radical filmmaker, and I'm happy about it. I'm glad, because I've arrived at that place too, where I understand, you know, to some degree, I understand, you know, the persistence and the difficulty that, and the obstacles that Kafi faces in her life, and other people of color. And I think my awakening part was sort of seeing people who had become friends go through this and be surprised by it, and finally realizing that I had the power as a filmmaker to sort of do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you both touched on so many important themes and things that we've seen in this film, and I think you know, kind of going back to this other side of Boston, who are, you know, really exposing a lot of the realities that so many Native Bostonians go through, really exploring who these resources in the city are designed for and are targeted to, and the lack of access of opportunity in reaching those, and, you know, ultimately how that impacts our ability to really achieve that upward mobility, to achieve economic prosperity, especially for those who truly do need it the most. And I know that there's been a lot of really great comments in the chat box going on. So I do want to at least open it up to some of the folks here to ask questions for Kafi or James about their experience, you know, and kind of share some of your thoughts. So I'll let you, I know Jared did reach out, and I know he has a couple of questions, want to share some things, so I'll kind of open it up to you.
Thanks, Marynee, and thank you to James and Kafi for this great film that really, you know, ultimately it touches on a couple different things, but it can only scratch the surface, right, of so many things, and I've seen the city change, and I've moved away, and you know, you can't even, it's like they'll ask you to leave a public meeting, but it's like, what's the legality surrounding that? You know, is that even legal to do? Or is it just expected that you kind of, you know, step and fall in line with that in order to be granted further access to other things down the line? I could see that being the scenario because I've worked with the police, I've worked with the Boston Foundation, I've worked with a lot of different organizations in the city, and everything is interconnected. And the fact that, you know, they'll say, turn off the cameras because we're going to tell you something that may or may not be legal is not ultimately surprising to me. I think that the visibility of this film is really important. It's very, very, very difficult to get a voice or to get any recognition as Black and brown people in the city, whether that be locally, nationally. So it's really, these things are really suppressed so that folks can look the other way. And in a larger context, Boston is built upon cultural exclusion and apartheid. There is a white culture and understanding of what Boston is and what it offers. And what, I mean, I find out during the pandemic, one of the most eye-opening things for me was to hear about all these Boston classic restaurants that were shutting down that I had never heard of. Never heard anyone mention that. My family's been here in the 50s. I'm like, what are these classic institutions that you should just, and it was
Kafi Dixon's was a classic institution in Grove Hall. I don't know about everything else.
Right. So there's a lot of,
Mm-hmm.
but it, you know, that's echoed my entire life since a very young age. And the more films and the more documentaries that talk about the hard things on the ground, the better. Because what I have found is there's a lot of self-patting on the back.
Yes.
And it's not to say, look, Boston is liberal and there are a lot of resources available. It's one of the things that I like about the city. But there are so many things that are issues in the city where people will go to any length to justify them and say that they're not issues, or it could be worse, or this or that. It's really infuriating, right? It's really infuriating. And so I could sense that sort of anger coming from you, James, and coming from you, Kafi, because the full story of Boston and what is going on is so rarely told, that I watch any film that is more holistic in its approach. I think that exclusion culturally extends deeply into the business community. Politically, that's starting to change.
Yes.
But in the business community and still the philanthropic community, that is the dominant, I mean, it is a very, you basically have to be in people's good graces and talk and approach things a certain way and not pick at anything too hard, because you'll get kicked out of the public meeting.
You will be blackballed in Boston if you go in there and start using keywords like, and asking a diverse class and sometimes diverse cultured space, you know, how are we upholding white supremacy? And anytime we bring up these words of white supremacy, you know, everybody paints us as, you know, the Black Panthers or something else, but really we should flip it. How are we as a diverse race culture upholding white supremacy in Boston by not asking for diversity in spaces? There was never a time, at any time I went to conferences, or I took 2 and 3 women with me who didn't even know why they were there. Because I wanted as much as possible to integrate that space to, one, show what was possible, but to introduce that space to other women, to let them know, you know, for your dreams and ambitions for yourself and for your children, these spaces exist. Some of the hardcore data that I was surprised that I knew that BDP had out, and I was surprised that this gentleman on the call for BDP didn't recognize, where there were things that talked about a mother in poverty her daughters are something like 50 or 60% more likely to be in poverty if the mother doesn't work her way out of poverty. There are statistics in this think tank city that explain the detriment of the lack of economic development to younger grade school children right now. If we think about the prison, the pipeline industrial complex, the lack of economic development, sustainability, and inclusion in the life of a Black and brown boy, right? Or girl, what are the statistics that Black or brown will either interact with the police or interact with the criminal justice system?
And I would like to talk to that just a bit, in saying that
we don't know each other, so I'm glad
right.
to feel like we were able to have this. Thank you.
I mean, this whole film felt like a documentary of my own life, right? I used to go to the Concord Baptist Church. It was shut down, turned into condos. I've had friends shot, family members who died. I've had family who's been gentrified and pushed throughout New England. And, you know, in most of like Hyde Park, Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, lots of Rosendale are very low opportunity areas for children. Some of the lowest opportunity areas for children in New England. Yet this is the economic hub of New England. And unfortunately, Boston for a very long time has been chasing the external dollar because it wasn't really a wealthy city for its own residents until maybe even just like 10 years ago, if that. So the city has been driven by a need to attract and retain driven people who typically, they might come from outside towns or just other states, but those people who typically come for college or stay or whatever the case may be, right? But that is who the city is very dependent on, and is how it has sort of elevated itself economically to where it is, retaining those people at all costs and sort of pushing what they would probably call problem populations out onto other cities who really aren't even equipped. When you say New Bedford and Fitchburg, those cities are not really equipped to handle any more people who are without a community and without resources than they already have. And it just continues a cycle of generational poverty there.
Let's frame this out. Marynee, if you don't mind to give us 5 seconds, Jared, to frame this out for the audience and understanding and taking that understanding and put it into factual context for anybody that may doubt that. In every panel, I mentioned the 2030 report. And I remember sitting on the bus at my job for the T and flipping through and seeing this plea about the brain drain. And I remember it was coming around the same time that the city was expanding, that universities were making a demand on housing. So let's be factual. The city fully understood, and I explained this to the gentleman at BPBA, the city fully understood that they needed to prepare for a population explosion demanded by the universities and graduate students. And then the reason that they needed to keep the graduate students here, according to the 2030 report, and they wrote about the brain drain, is because they wanted to develop a larger tax economic base and to being larger biotech. GE came in, Clark's shoes is here, Converse is here. So they wanted to make sure that they had the employment pool locked, right? So thereby you naturally deem anybody that's not part of that employment pool, the mass population, the city had to make decisions about what was the employment pool here. Somebody somewhere wrote a report that either justified or supported the displacement of entire communities based on the employment pool for larger corporations as a tax base and universities as an employment pool for those corporations that were tax based. But that came at the same time when the powers that be were trying to close down one of the few trade schools, historic trade schools in the city of Boston, which was Madison Park ORC. So let's connect it and talk about generational poverty and talk about displacement and talk about the need for ICIC or whoever is a thought leader to put together these public-private partnerships, and that it is only going to take us as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, right? My voice was as a marginalized, but it was as the marginalized first as a business owner, advocating for development of open development and access of other potential business owners or people who are interested in community and neighborhood development and design that benefited all. So if you look at the reports, the lack of economic development for people of color literally is a space that's held up by white supremacy to say that a lot of the corporations that are run predominantly by white men have in universities that the upper management and upper admin and trustees are also non-people of color, have thereby put pressure on a community that, because of the lack of economic development and business development and capital assistance and mentorship and consulting, has made that community vulnerable and thereby deemed it a victim of displacement.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's crazy to also think about how, to your point, how that's ingrained into the future of the city.
It is.
How that's seen as an element that is, in order to advance the city, ultimately one of the costs to pay is displacement of Native Bostonians, and thinking through that. I know that there was someone else in the audience who also wanted to share, so I'll call upon Diego to kind of add some remarks as well.
Yeah, I think Kafi and James, great conversation, but I think one of the things that always struck me was we have these conversations around development on rather long timelines that youth don't always see for themselves. And I remember mentoring a young man a few years ago and having a conversation with him when we talked about college and the kind of life he wanted to have, etc. And then one day I was sitting with him and I said, okay, let's just take a moment. Where do you see yourself at 25? And his answer was 50% odds that I'm still alive. As a Black Latino youth, I will be stopped by the cops, I will do this, I will do that, I will be in the wrong place at the wrong time, 50% odds that I'm even alive. So how do you have a conversation about development, about generational wealth, etc., if your expectations are 50-50, I'm alive at 25?
I think that what we again miss is how the business community speaks to this. The business community and people who support the business community have more power in this national conversation around policing, around incarceration, around poverty, around violence than we'd like to admit. I was resentful through the documentary and have talked about this because if I was just starting a business for myself, I could have left the city and went and done what I was going to do. And that caused me the most anger and frustration. It was endless. That I knew that if I was just to go to another city with the money that I had, with my savings, I would be fine. But I also knew for that privilege that I had the ability to do so, that the women that I was advocating for did not have that privilege to just to pick up and move. In fact, the probability would be that they would be displaced and forced to move out of crisis rather than to make the choice to move to a new community. I say to the business community that we have more power, than we realize. to push back on the experiences. If we think about George Floyd, we think about the young man who still is experiencing trauma because it was a policy at his job that if you accepted a counterfeit bill, it came out of your paycheck. And that was a policy that was put in place by a business owner. And the young man asking that if he would have just paid the $20 or not said anything about it being a counterfeit and been forced to call the police, would George Floyd still be alive? That is a conversation around the business community and how we address violence. And we're not saying anything, again, in a think tank of a city that somebody has not already done a dissertation, a thesis, or put down research through BPDA or the city of Boston. But to be able to say, to hold the business, even through corporate giving, to hold the business community to task about how we look at community violence in all forms and spectrums may be a conversation that's too weighty to be initiated by outside forces, but may have to be initiated, again, through our community and our sector within ourselves as an intention.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I think it kind of goes back to, again, who's having these conversations, who's initiating it, and who's really being able to have these reckonings. Because again, unless you're able to really dissect and think through the different privileges and the different powers that we all respectively have, it's, you know, there is that power in being able to mobilize, and there is that power to come together to say, you know what, we've noticed this, we realize this is an issue, and now we're going to use that collective power to try to enact some form of change, or trying to change that narrative in some way.
And I'm not saying that the business community, I mean, I'm not saying that we need to get out there with signs. I'm not saying that at all. But if we understand that the civil rights movement was that the civil rights movement started by an economic force of denying, it wasn't just about not riding the bus, it was about not putting our financial resources to a system of transportation that was marginalizing. Exactly. And even now, even the corporate responsibilities, they're statistically saying that Gen Z and Gen X are more likely to purchase from a corporation that is environmentally responsible and responsive. So, I mean, we as business people can talk about the win-win-win for new entrepreneurs and established businesses and corporations on why they would want to get ahead of the curve on these conversations as a demographic of consumers.
Exactly. Kafi and James, I want to thank you all so much for such a dynamic conversation. I mean, I kind of knew that this was going to happen, that we were going to that this conversation was just going to flow naturally, and that there would be so much to share. I know we are kind of approaching 6 p.m., but I know something that I did hear from a lot of team members was, how can I share this documentary? How can I share the next film screening, the next opportunity to promote this film and make sure that more folks are able to access and see this? So would love to, if you can just share, what are some other opportunities for folks to buy tickets to watch the documentary or learn more?
We're going to be screening at the Roxbury International Film Festival coming up at the end of June. And so that'll be a really good opportunity to see the film coming up. And check our website at reckoninginboston.com. We've got events happening, you know, every week, and there's opportunities to partner with us. If, you know, anyone here who's part of any other organization that would want to screen the film, we're looking for those kinds of partnerships like we've had with you this evening. And also follow us on social media and tell your friends about the film. And we want to keep having these kinds of conversations. So.
Yeah, the same here. I'm hoping that we start thinking about economic development, not in fear of it, but embracing a diverse fabric of a city. It can only benefit us. And to look at the statistics, but also to talk about what is the perception of Boston nationally by other people of color. And the reality of that, it was touched in the race series in the Boston Globe years ago, that there are people who have just graduated from Harvard or come out of some of our institutions who with determination were not interested in staying in the city. And we're moving to the space of the city being homogenous to its detriment and only becoming a place where you come and get an education, try to afford to live here for a while, and then leave. Right. And that's not a brain drain. That's a drain of culture, diversity, and inclusion. So I hope that this documentary can be a tool in looking at public and private partnerships for making sure that there is capital available to follow, for business owners to follow their dreams, and to highlight this organization and the work that we've been able to do with my guidance. And I don't talk about this a lot. We've been able to help 3 women start businesses. I'm forgetting their names, but one of them, she was we just did a tough certification for her as a community health worker, and she owns a Reiki studio in Newton. So, and I talk to her constantly about what type of government, state, and city contracts there are enabled for her to do her work, and her sisters. So just in these conversations as a business owner on the ground, we've been able to encourage more business development. And so if we think about it in that way, the mountain turns into a molehill, and it's something that we can all overcome.
Definitely. Oh my God, that's amazing to hear, and I think such a great way to close out our conversation here. Once again, thank you both so much. Thank you to Marga and for everybody for helping to organize this and putting this together. We're definitely going to share more information about the film festival and link to that, and we encourage everyone here to continue to promote the film festival and promote the documentary to your networks.
And promote inclusion.
Yes, very important with that too. So again, such a powerful conversation. Still a conversation that still needs to be had. And there's so many things that I knew we couldn't get on today with such a short, limited amount of time. And looking forward for the folks at ICIC to continue having these things and to think more critically and how these really apply to the work that we're doing as an organization.
I've gone ahead and put my email into the chat box. Feel free to reach out to us at any time through ICIC or otherwise. We really are supportive of these conversations, and we'd like to be able to support if we can do anything to help you facilitate this conversation with the documentary and otherwise. We're definitely here for it. We are.
Awesome. Definitely. I'm looking forward to it. The conversation doesn't end here.
Not at all. Not at all. Thank you, Jared. And thank you
Jared,
for
thank
all
you.
the participation, and thank you, Steve. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We really
have a good evening.
Thank you.
And be safe this holiday weekend.
Yes, thank you. And try to stay cool today. I know.
As a little sweat glisten. Yeah, waiting for the sun to go down. We're on it. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a good night.
Bye. Have a good day.
Bye.